this. Firstly, when we lived in smaller communities, people all knew each other. I can assure you of it because the family on my mother's side originates from a small village 500 strong, and you would go to the pub in the evening and the next day the whole village would know how much you've been drinking. In those type of close-knit communities there is a natural social observation present, which has a very, very positive effect on the social fibre of the community, and crime used to be rare. It's like this all over the world that small communities have big communications. Today, we live in anonymous cities with millions of people, and of course, free movement. Since Baader-Meinhof, the guerrilla war started, and whilst the Baader-Meinhof-Krieg was pointed against industrialists and politicians, the IRA carried out mass bombings indiscriminately. Now Al-Qaeda also carries out the indiscriminate killings against civilians. I condone all those activities because they kill the innocent bystanders. They are not part of a mass movement, as for example the French, Russian and Chinese, Cuban, East German revolutions have been. A more recent example is Venezuela. Now, all these countries have some form of police force. The police in East Germany, a revolutionary communist state, was in fact twice as bad as our police force because they shot people who wanted to climb over the fence, separating the country from the outside world. It doesn't matter whether a country is capitalist, communist, socialist, because they all have a police force to keep the public safe. Today we get warnings about erosion of civil liberties. What civil liberties? The only restriction so far has been the right to demonstrate outside of the Houses of Parliament, and this restriction is currently under review. Demonstrations are still allowed under police escort, and in many cases the police protect the demonstrators more than they restrict them. Some unions are no longer allowed to strike, but working conditions within those professions can be resolved by other means than strike. Many vulnerable persons like women, ethnic minorities, often totally depend on the police to protect them, and of course victims of crime have no one else to turn to but the police. Now in my view, a CCTV simply replaces the old-fashioned whisper news round, which always existed in small communities. Criminals and terrorists only prosper in areas of anonymity. In fact, the German Red Army faction could establish operations in Germany only because of the privatized housing system, which advertised short-term rental contracts countrywide, and landlords didn't have to report or rent any property. And of course the existence of one form of ID, namely an ID card, which was quite easy to forge, enabled terrorists to settle into rented accommodations, and it took 40,000 police officers to find out where they were. The RAF, Red Army faction, saw themselves as carders of public opinion, but failed to establish a mass movement because the masses didn't want such an action and did not see such an action necessary or desirable, hence they never passed the terrorist stage. Then the IRA started to drag their conflicts into the British mainland and killed and maimed innocent bystanders in buses and market squares. Trumped by Al-Qaeda, who bombed indiscriminately and hit mass targets like the Twin Towers in New York, not to forget Lockerbie, a Libyan-led attack. I don't feel my rights are restricted through strong police presence. I feel without strong police presence my safety is in jeopardy, and that's thanks to those so-called freedom fighters. If they are freedom fighters, I don't know what warped idea of freedom they have got. The only concern for my freedom I have got is if I cannot legally defend myself. Cut back in legal aid, decrease in democratic accountability, freedom of expression and speech, freedom of movement and ability to choose a workplace. People seem to forget that during Hitler, people were forced to join the army to get any food. There was no alternative. Socialists should pinpoint and fight those areas of public law which restrict our democratic freedoms and not policing. Policing itself is not a negative occurrence, but if fascists got hold of records and picked people according to race or creed, color or religion or political beliefs and carried out ethnic or ideological cleansing, that would be negative. But you can do that also without CCTV, as Hitler's star on the slave campaign proved to the whole wide world. Socialists should stop wasting our time with old-fashioned, outdated dogmas. Be in tune with the times and don't try and sell us the Russian Revolution over and over again when we live in the UK in the 21st century. Holding on to old dogmas helps us to go to the dogs rather than helps us to progress. Our country today is socialist, apart from equality in wealth distribution not being equal enough, but instead of holding on to ancient models of organizations, unions that think afresh and recognize today's modern problems where the shortfalls are is constantly changing, and the need to strike must be related to overall economic factors, and the unions often ignore other important factors like the environment and legislation in many aspects of our life where our rights are being eroded. On the other hand, we get too many different protest groups demonstrating against the same thing. This strength could be used more useful, and coordination is an important factor. For example, housing privatization would disable our council tenants to vote out their current political landlord, a local authority, for another administration, and make all tenants subject to civil legislature, whereby problems have to be resolved in courts, and legal aid for those types of problems is in the process of being cut. That is a very important problem. But where are the protests about that? Apart from the Legal Aid Bureau, I have heard very little protest. The ability to get free dental treatment has been reduced because economic pressure stipulated dentists to turn away NHS patients. People can no longer choose not to work and continue to get benefits. People cannot quit a job without loss of benefits for 6 months. This can be exploited to drive people into working for the army if the state decides to increase the war effort. In 2007, I have never seen so many comparisons to Hitler times and warnings that our governments are on the path to fascism. When I came to Great Britain, it was we always were against the fascists and fought Hitler, and now the free world government is often compared to having Hitler tactics, whereby Blair and Bush were made to look like Hitler with moustaches and hairstyles. I really want to appeal to the left not to be overzealous and waste the goodwill of the people on useless arguments. Privatization is going to run itself down after some time because market forces simply do not work out for mathematical dynamics reasons. See my video about equality and equality 2, where I describe how banking produces money through debt and interest. In my view, the way we live today is not helping us because our unnatural lifestyles are against our very nature and instincts and ruin our ability to sense and feel and apply our natural instincts. Like the Roman Empire ceased to exist because the Romans drank water from lead pipes, which poisoned their minds and they went literally mad, we today poison our children with mercury or too many immunizations, and we increasingly become weaker people through our lifestyle, which promotes lack of exercise. I also think socialists should stop confusing people with old-fashioned doctrines, or people who believe or want to think about revolutions all the time should start a revolutionist church and declare this a religion, because citing Marx, Engels and Lenin is comparable to reading texts from the Bible, whereas Das Kapital is the Bible of all socialists.